In 1932, Stan, Laurel, and Oliver Hardy, better known as Stan and Ollie, were at the height of their careers. Before being paired by producer Hal Roach in 1927, both had already found success in the early days of Hollywood and silent comedy. Once united, their popularity soared, and they became one of the most celebrated comedy duos in history, a status they continue to hold today. While best known for their slapstick comedies, Laurel and Hardy occasionally ventured into films that explored themes beyond their usual repertoire. One such example is Pack Up Your Troubles, their second feature-length film, released on the 17th of September 1932. The story begins during World War I, depicting America's entry into the conflict before transitioning to the post-war years. In addition to its comedic elements, the film touches on the loss of comrades in battle and the emotional impact on their families and loved ones. Of particular interest to tank enthusiasts, it also briefly features a US M1917 tank, the American-built version of the French Renault FT. Though its screen time is limited, its inclusion adds a unique historical detail to the film. Introduced in 1917, the Renault FT was a groundbreaking design. It featured a fully rotating turret, a leaf spring suspension, and an engine compartment separate from the crew. The FT proved highly effective on the shell-pocked battlefields of Europe during the First World War and remained in service long after its introduction. When the US sought a domestically produced tank, the FT was the natural choice. Lieutenant Colonel George S. Patton, who would later command the U.S. Third Army in World War II, strongly advocated for American tank production. The U.S.-built version of the FT was designated the Model 1917 6-ton light tank. However, none saw combat as the war ended before they could be deployed. Although the initial order called for 4,400 units, only 950 were ultimately produced. Although the M1917 was a derivative of the Renault FT, it featured several key differences. One of the most notable changes was the replacement of the original engine with a 42-horsepower Buda HU, which allowed the tank to reach a maximum speed of 8.9 kilometers per hour. The running gear remained identical to that of the FT, featuring a small rear sprocket wheel and a large disc idler at the front, giving the track system its distinctive teardrop shape. The suspension included 8 road wheels mounted on bogies, with a full-length skid supporting the track return. One of the easiest ways to distinguish the M1917 from its French counterpart is the placement of the exhaust. While the FT's exhaust is positioned on the right side of the hull, the M1917's is located on the left. The M1917 was armed with either a 7.62mm Marlin machine gun or a short 37mm M1916 cannon. However, in 1919, all tanks originally equipped with Marlin machine guns were refitted with Browning M1919 7.62mm machine guns. While the overall armor values remain largely the same, the armor layout of the M1917 differed slightly from that of the FT. The M1917 featured a riveted angular turret made of 15mm thick armor plate. The later ball mount for its single weapon was protected by a 15mm thick gun shield. The hull design closely resembled that of the FT, though the driver's compartment had a slightly different shape. Maximum hull armor remained limited to 15mm. Despite advancements in tank design, many nations continued to operate FT-type tanks for years, lacking the resources to produce or acquire modern replacements. Surprisingly, one of these nations was the United States of America. The M1917 appears on screen for only about 2 minutes in the 68-minute film. It plays no significant role in the story's outcome and serves primarily as a prop for a comedic gag. Before describing its use, it's important to briefly summarize the events leading up to its appearance and explain how the hapless duo ends up on the Western Front. The film begins in April 1917 as the United States enters World War I, a moment foreshadowed by the opening crawl. April 1917, when the scratch of a pen on Capitol Hill caused crowns to rattle. On the 2nd of April 1917, President Woodrow Wilson formally requested that Congress approve a declaration of war against Germany. 4 days later, on the 6th of April, the United States officially joined the conflict. The next day, Oliver sits on a park bench with Stan, reading a newspaper emblazoned with the bold headline, "War Declared." As he discusses the situation, he remarks that if not for his flat feet, he would enlist without hesitation. However, fate intervenes. The pair soon find themselves voluntold into service by a recruiting officer, played by Tom Kennedy. As they navigate military life, they stumble through several comedic misadventures, and along the way befriend Eddie Smith, played by Dan Dillaway. Sometime later, the pair find themselves way out west on the front lines with the American Expeditionary Force. The exact year, date, time, and location are unspecified. However, the presence of a tank on the American line suggests that the events take place in 1918, near the end of the war. The scene opens with a crawl that reads, "Somewhere in nowhere, where the cannons boomed all day and the cooties boomed all night." Stan, Ollie, and Eddie are asleep in a dugout at the U.S.-held front line when they're abruptly awoken by a sergeant, played by Pat Harmon. It's their turn to stand watch. Before heading out, the boys ask Eddie for his daughter's address so they can send her a Christmas present. After handing it over, Eddie leaves the dugout to take his post. Moments later, the Germans launched a raid on the trench. Stan and Ollie hurriedly grabbed their gear and rushed to the line, only to discover that Eddie had been killed in the attack. In response, the captain, played by Bud Fine, orders the sergeant to organize a retaliatory raid to capture a prisoner. Having already irritated the sergeant earlier with a mishap involving coffee, Stan and Ollie once again find themselves voluntold for the mission. Doubting their competence, the sergeant turns to his corporal and mutters,
"Corporal, get 2 replacements. I think we'll need them."
Hey, Sergeant.
Dodging small arms and artillery fire, they take cover behind an abandoned tank wedged in a shell crater. The relentless bombardment makes it impossible to leave, prompting Ollie to yank up the tank's hatch and exclaim,
Let's get in here. We'll be out of danger.
But as always, with Stan and Ollie, safety is never a guarantee. Stan dives headfirst into the driver's compartment just as Ollie shuts him in and scrambles up the front of the tank toward the cupola hatch. Inside the cramped interior, Stan struggles to turn around and reach the driver's seat, but accidentally pushes the throttle. The tank lurches forward, clawing its way up the steep crater wall. Thrown from the driver's seat, Stan flails helplessly as the vehicle surges ahead, completely out of control. Clinging to the front for dear life, Ollie can do little but hang on. Panicked, Stan tugs frantically at the control levers, sending the tank careening in all directions while Ollie, still outside, fights to keep his grip. At last, the slightly more corpulent Ollie manages to pry open the top hatch and dives in head first, only to get stuck halfway, his legs flailing wildly from the cupola. As the tank bucks and bounces across the cratered battlefield, the pair's familiar squeals and blubbering fill the air. Desperate to pull Ollie inside, Stan gives one final yank, only to lose what little control he had. Now entirely unchecked, the tank plows through the barbed wire in front of the German trench, lumbers over the parapet, and crashes straight into the enemy's defenses. Having fallen into the trench, the tank rumbles along its interior, dragging behind it the barbed wire it had snagged earlier. The German troops inside are thrown into a panic, scrambling to escape as they pour out of the trench. Meanwhile, Stan manages to regain partial control and begins steering the tank back toward the U.S. position. What he and Ollie fail to realize, however, is that many of the fleeing Germans have become entangled in the barbed wire, resulting in the accidental capture of an entire trench's worth of enemy soldiers. Witnessing the chaos unfold, the American troops emerge from their trenches and rush toward the now stationary tank. As they begin rounding up the captured Germans, Stan and Ollie attempt to climb out. Ollie, having finally made it inside, now finds himself awkwardly sprawled atop Stan in the cramped driver's compartment. As the two hapless comrades struggle to free themselves, the screen fades to black and transitions to a scene set sometime after the war. This sequence, lasting roughly 2 minutes, marks the extent of the tank's role in the film. The rest of the story follows Stan and Ollie as they embark on a mission to find their late friend Eddie's daughter. Believing it their duty to care for the child, they set out to rescue her from the abusive environment she was left in while her father was away at war. The tank can be identified as a late-model M1917 by its shielded 37mm M1916 gun mount. While the tank used for the external shots was authentic, a replica interior set was also constructed, though it appears only briefly on screen. The interior recreation was largely faithful to the real design, aside from a few minor details, and even replicated the external shape of the crew compartment. As is common with tank interior sets, it was slightly oversized to accommodate filming logistics, including actor comfort and lighting. Notable interior details, such as the commander's sling seat, were accurately reproduced, hanging from the turret interior. The controls were also faithfully represented. However, there were some key inaccuracies, most notably the large driver's seat and the oversized hand throttle on the interior wall. In the film, the driver is shown using a large, curved, fixed seat. In reality, the driver sat on a platform approximately 15 centimeters above the hull floor, with a backrest formed by webbing suspended between the interior walls. Additionally, the film depicts a large hand throttle on the left interior wall, which is incorrect. While the M1917 did have a hand throttle, it was significantly smaller and positioned to the driver's right alongside the gear stick. The tank's origins remain somewhat of a mystery. Although the M1917 was considered obsolete, it remained in U.S. Army service until 1931, with some sources suggesting it was not fully phased out until the mid-1930s. However, some National Guard units retained them beyond that period. This lends credibility to the widely accepted belief that the tank was loaned from the California National Guard, specifically the 40th Tank Company of the 160th Infantry Regiment based in Salinas, California. One indication that the tank may have originated from the National Guard is that multiple personnel from the 160th Infantry Regiment served as extras in the battle scenes, portraying both American and German soldiers. Additionally, the 40th Tank Company still had M1917 tanks in its inventory as late as 1934, deploying them during the California labor strikes that same year. Around this time, U.S. Secretary of War George Dern called for the development of new light tanks and combat cars, ultimately paving the way for the next generation of American armored vehicles. Another possible source of the tank is M.C. Bradley Military Rental Studios based in North Hollywood. Between 1922 and 1967, Bradley operated a business that supplied military equipment for film productions. His collection included at least 4 M1917 tanks, all of which have survived to the present day. One of these tanks was previously used in the 1927 silent war film Wings. Unfortunately, little else is known about M.C. Bradley, as he had largely faded into the depths of Hollywood history. A key piece of evidence suggesting that the tank in the film may have come from his collection is the Amsco tracks visible in multiple stills. At least one of Bradley's surviving M1917s retains these tracks, along with the same 37mm gun configuration. However, because Amsco tracks were fairly common on M1917 tanks, this similarity may be coincidental. Following Bradley's death in the late 1960s, his collection was sold off. Today, the surviving M1917s from his inventory can be found at the American Heritage Museum in Massachusetts, the West Point Museum in New York, and the American Armored Foundation Museum. A fourth example is privately owned by Hayes Otupolik in Missouri. Although their popularity waned over time, Laurel and Hardy continued making films well into the 1950s, releasing a total of 106 movies during their 30-year partnership. As for the M1917 featured on screen, its fate remains unknown. This concludes our video on the US M1917's brief Hollywood career. Did you find today's video interesting? Would you like to see more videos like this in the future? Share your opinions in the comments section below. If you haven't done so already, we invite you to subscribe to stay updated on future content. If you'd like to contribute further, consider supporting us on Patreon or PayPal. Your contributions help us create more engaging videos. Until next time, stay focused and stay tuned.